My name is Phil Boucher. I'm a composer, most recently of Heroish. I'm also known for Fortnite. I've worked on a couple of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Maleficent, DuckTales, Civilization 6, and a ton of other stuff.
Yeah, it's super interesting. You've been in the film and television industry for quite a long time, Phil. Like, what's it been like seeing this industry evolve over these last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, it's funny because I still feel like I'm just getting started, but it has been a while. I moved out here in 2008 and did the whole like be someone's assistant for several years thing, and I ended up at Hans Zimmer's place at Remote Control, and so I saw like even just the evolution of that place and how it evolved. Like technology has come such a long way in that regard. Like when I started, all of the big name composers like Ramin and Steve Jablonsky and Henry Jackman, everyone worked there. And now everyone has home studios. So their assistants work there and then they come in for client meetings or something, but it's a very different atmosphere. I mean, same with this place. Like I never could have had a setup like this that was so sort of compact and bespoke to me when I first moved out here. It was a Mac Pro with a couple like kind of crappy samples and I did what I could, but like now everyone has access to like all of the best stuff and you just it's all at your fingertips. It's super affordable, at least compared to what it used to be. And I feel like that's sort of that's come across in the whole industry, right? Like all technological strides have made game development easier, has made like getting through the pandemic and having Zoom calls with people, everyone working from home, but they can still talk about the latest picture edit or they can still come together. So it's sort of democratized and decentralized the process. I think that's probably the biggest shift that I've seen.
When you're by yourself, I mean, if you're an independent contractor, correct? It's your own studio, your own business, or are you a subsidiary of a bigger company that places you in workspaces?
No, it's just me.
So it's just you. So it's really interesting when you're by yourself. The workflow difference when making a score for video game or TV show, where like you worked at Hans Zimmer's place, had a friend who interned there, and there's so many subcategories of jobs. Like your job is just to do this and nothing else, and this job is just to do this. Like you have this team mentality of like 30 people working on a movie score, which I think a lot of people don't understand how big these teams are. Just in music in general, like it's multiple people, but there's only one guy who gets his name on the original music composed by, and 30 other finishers and mixers and writers they get shuffled into the thing. It's quite a daunting task.
Well, and that still happens in my world. Even though I'm an independent contractor, I still work with orchestrators and mixers and obviously musicians when I get something recorded. Like, I love to play instruments and I've got a wall full of guitars and other things, but like there's a lot of stuff I can't play, and I love working with other musicians that are going to come in and bring their own personality and their own talents and their own perspective. And orchestration is the same thing, right? Like I get it to a place that it sounds good to me, but then once they put it on paper, stuff always looks different, right? So like someone looks at it and says, actually, there's a big hole here in the woodwinds, you forgot to write that section. And then the mock-up with drums and everything going on, you can't really hear it, but it's something that just having other sort of checks and balances along the way. Same with a mixer. Like I try to get it to sound pretty good, but someone else comes in and they're gonna just beef it up more than where I could get it to.
Can you talk about like some of your background, like your education? Were you classically trained in composition and music, or you self-taught?
Definitely not classically trained. I went to Berklee College of Music in Boston for college, and I had done I grew up first playing the trumpet and then switched to guitar. So I had music lessons and I was interested in that stuff, but it wasn't until I went to college that I had any real like formal education. But it was Berklee started as a jazz school, and that's very much still their mentality, jazz and pop, and the classical stuff is sort of secondary. I came to film scoring kind of late, and I feel like I've been playing catch up for the last 15 years to kind of like get better at that side of things before I get found out for not knowing what I'm doing. And I love that side of stuff. So it's a passion for me to dive into scores, and I've got a collection of scores back there, and I love learning about that as just as much as about like production and about playing an instrument and learning new things. Yeah, so at this point it's definitely a combination of self-taught and what I learned in school.
And you've been doing this for a long time. Can you kind of talk about how you fell into video games specifically? Because there's a lot of video, documentary stuff, short stuff, TV stuff on your resume, but video games is something you've fallen into a lot these last couple of years.
Well, I think part of that is also sort of due to the pandemic, like we talked about. games are the one thing that didn't go anywhere, right? So the film industry and the TV industry were panicked at least that first year. Like, how do we do this? We can't get people in a room together. We can't finish anything. If anything wasn't already shot, they couldn't do it. Where games, people could just bring their computers home and for the most part keep the dev cycle going. Obviously, if you've got like a voice actor, you've got a like motion capture or something, people have to be on a stage somewhere, but it's still isolated and it's still sort of like one or two people at a time. So I think that played a lot into how much game stuff I've been doing lately. It all kind of got started from a college roommate that I had. He moved out a couple years after me. He moved down to San Diego and worked at a game studio there and just befriended some people, and they would do these like beer hangouts once a month, or there's so many breweries down there, and they'd get together and he's like, oh, you should come down and just like meet these guys. And I'm like, oh, sure. Like I was an assistant to Jeff Zanelli at the time. Like, I'm just getting started. Like, I'm not trying to network. I'm not trying to go be like, hey, get me to score your next game, because I have no business doing that. He's like, no, they're just good people. Just come hang out, drink beer. So I went down there and met a few of these people, and just over time, like, we all became friends and stayed in touch. And the studio that they worked at shut down, as often happens with a lot of these smaller studios. They just like, they shipped whatever game they were doing, and then everyone kind of branches out to different places. So like that core group of 5 guys now work at 5 different studios, and so now I have like an in at all these different places. And that's like, it just kind of happened organically. It's nothing I ever could have planned. But even Heroish, I got because I was recommended from the sound designer, who was one of those core group of people back in San Diego.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, they always say that in the industry, and it's 100% true. It's not about what you know, it's about who you know. You know, like, networking is so important in our industry. Speaking of that, like, you did the music for Heroish. Do you tackle video game scores like Heroish differently than like TV or even film scores? I mean, like, you worked on DuckTales, which is a huge Disney show, but that's like, you know, you're making music to picture that's set, stone, approved, right? Sometimes has a big X if it's not. But like in video games, sometimes you're just given like a 30-second clip, or even in the very early stage, some concept art, and like they're like, make a theme.
It's definitely different. I mean, sometimes you have cutscenes in a game, and that's very similar to what you would do in TV or film, because you've got linear picture, even if they're still working on it, in the same way that a picture edit is never really locked. You know, like, it's close enough to treat it like a linear picture. But so much of what I do is loops or stingers based on, sometimes there's like a music doc that has very specific requests or references. A lot of times there's a little bit of concept art, and they just like throw out different musical ideas that they have and say, oh, we kind of like this and we kind of like this. This one producer put this on the list, and like none of them have anything to do with each other, which I think is a pretty common thing with like any media music. Is like, the joy is sort of, how do you marry these different influences that you would never just like go listen to that band's album because it's just all over the place. But somehow in the context of this project, it makes sense to have metal guitars with Celtic instruments and medieval stuff. Like, it's a different world, kind of.
If you were to describe your sound, like what you'd like using when you make music for any medium, like video games or television film, like, what is your sound? Do you like, you know, piano, synth noises? Are you big on guitar? Like, talk about like your style.
That is a great question. That is probably impossible for me to be the one to answer. I had a producer once say to me, like, it's so great to like, all of my music has my like me-ness in it, and I have no idea what that means. Like, I don't know what the thing is that I do that comes, like, to me it all sounds different. I will say I'm not like a super electronic heavy synthy guy. I gravitate much more towards organic instruments, real world instruments. I love putting up a microphone and recording something, and I might like mangle it so by the time it's done it doesn't sound anything like what I started with. But I definitely gravitate towards live instruments, live instrumentation. I think a lot of that comes out of when I hear something that's just a mock-up that's 100% samples. To me, it kind of sounds like sheet music. It's like, this is the impression of what your piece will be. But, you know, budgets and time being what they are, you don't always have the chance to go in and like fully record everything with a live orchestra. So if I can bring some layers of life to it, literally, with like guitars and vocals, percussion, whatever I can get my hands on. Like I feel like that pushes it out of that like sheet music world.
Does working in video games like Heroish, like independent game projects, open up more for you creatively than when you're working for a much bigger company, say like Disney?
Not necessarily. I think it depends a lot more on like the particular director or studio. Sometimes if you walk into an established franchise, they've got a very clear idea of what they want. I worked on this game called Orcs Must Die 3, which was the third in a franchise, and it was a pretty limited palette of what the first games were. It was kind of like drums, harpsichord, guitar. Like it was very small. But like that was the aesthetic of the game. So when I came into it, we expanded it somewhat. We brought in more orchestra and some additional colors, but like you're starting here and you kind of get this big with it, as opposed to something like Heroish or Fortnite, even DuckTales. Like sort of anything you can think of goes if there's a justification for it.
Is it more or less pressure when you're on a video game? Is it like more, do you have like more wiggle room to kind of experiment and more time to develop something, as opposed to like, I know TV is, used to work in TV, it's very quick turnarounds, very fast. Everything has to be approved almost immediately, and you're given hardly any time. It's such a fast turnaround for television specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done a ton of TV. DuckTales, and I wasn't the main composer. I was working with Dom Lewis, who was the guy. That was a pretty fast turnaround. I think it was around an episode a week, and it's 15 minutes of music an episode, so it's not as much as scoring like a Game of Thrones episode a week or something. I think they get a little more time for those. Games just depend though. Like usually I would say like in general the schedule is more relaxed. You kind of know stuff a little bit farther out. But in the same vein, it's relaxed because nothing exists yet. So it is that thing about concept art or just having conversations about tone and developing themes. But the game doesn't exist sometimes until it could be a year later, when you actually get this stuff in and see how it feels. And there could be a big process of revising all those cues that turns out actually don't work as well as you thought they did.
Now, for people out there who maybe aren't familiar with the film and television industry, can you talk about, like, for example, like it says you did Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales as additional music. Like, what does that mean?
Additional music can mean all sorts of things. In the case of that, it was, I think, similar to how every Pirates of the Caribbean movie happens, which is there's way too much music for any one person. And so you've got a lead composer. In this case, Jeff, he was my mentor for years, and he was the one who, after Hans stepped down or for whatever reason, took over the reins and came up with new themes. But there were so many established themes from Hans before that. So it was a little bit of a different case. Normally, it would be composer comes in, writes all the big themes, kind of like sketches out the big cues, maybe sketches out every cue, depending on how they like to work. And then they've got people that just kind of finish stuff or handle revisions, or occasionally they'll come up with their own themes. I can't say that I did any thematic writing for Pirates because there's just so much material already. But it really runs the spectrum, and I think additional music can get a bad rap, but I think it's a fantastic like place to cut your teeth. It's a place to be working on something that's like way outside of what you would be able to get project wise, right? Like I was writing for like one of the biggest Disney movies of the year, and no one knows who I am, right? So like to be able to have that and then have the resources that go with it, right? So we had like 100-piece orchestra and a 80-piece choir or something, and all the overdubs that we did, and then the best mixer in the world. And so like all of this stuff comes together, and you're kind of shielded from it, because if anything goes wrong, like Jeff is the one who has to, like, Jeff looks at everything that happens before it goes to a director. So he has to make sure that it's up to his bar of quality and it feels like the score that he wants it to be, because otherwise, like, he's the one who's going to get yelled at in the meeting if it doesn't go well.
Now, when you're working on a game like Heroish, which is obviously it's like a little Apple Arcade game, like pizza game, does budget come into a factor when, say, like compared to Fortnite? Obviously Fortnite has a much bigger budget than probably Heroish. Like, does that open up anything for you? Is it more difficult like when the budget's smaller or larger?
The thing about budgets is there's always ways to get creative with them. Usually I have nothing to do with the budget conversation. I mean, sometimes I get hired and then they say, whatever you want to do, it's up to you. It's coming out of your pocket, which is like, it's a pretty normal thing. But then there's also times where they have the purse strings and they're in charge of making all those calls. In the case of Heroish, it was a little bit of both. It was a little bit of like, hey, I want to do some things and I'm going to do it regardless. And then when we talked about bringing in the orchestra, like that was like the scope of the project changed when we started to realize how much the game would benefit from having an orchestra. But it's the same conversation on anything I work on. It's, do we need an orchestra? How big of an orchestra? Do we need soloists? It's kind of coming back to the sheet music thing I said before. The thing that I try to do when I write a score is I never want it to sound like we didn't have the money to do something properly. So if I'm scoring a game and they have no money at all and it's just me, I don't want it to just sound like I wrote samples for a 90-piece orchestra that we don't have. I want to do something interesting. So whether it's recording and trying to make it sound big through just processing and guitars, I think there's a lot of creativity that can come out of those limitations.
Is there a specific genre in gaming or in film that you like to work in? Because, you know, you've done everything from animated to like zany Fortnite games to horror movies. Like you've kind of dabbled in every kind of genre I can see, as far as I can see.
I get bored, so I like to do different
Yeah.
things. And I whenever I'm on the same style of project for too long, like for instance, one thing that happens a lot in games is there's just a lot of combat music. So that's something like every game, at least almost every game that I've worked on, a big portion of it is action, combat, battle. And at a certain point, like it gets old. You can only do it so many different ways until you can step back and kind of like reassess and have some fresh ideas. So like I've been doing so much that I'm like, I just want to do like a romantic comedy or just like a straight up drama with just whole notes and maybe it's a piano and a flute and a couple synths or something. So I can't say that there's a favorite thing that I like to do. Obviously, I like big orchestra and I like writing that kind of music. I think if I had to say where like my home is at this point, it is like the big orchestral thing. But if that was the only thing that I was doing, I'd still get bored of that.
And if you could give any advice to aspiring composers out there that want to specifically work in video games, what would you tell them?
Just start meeting people. I think more so than any sort of like technical limitations and learning, like learn Wise and Fmod and some of the middleware. There's like free tutorials online. You can go learn about like implementation. And I think implementation in games is important, but that's like so far down the field of if you're just trying to get started. One, just like practice writing music because writing good music is always helpful. But then it's just meeting people. Either there's like game jams and there's places you can go, like forums online, to meet indie developers that have no money and they're doing it in their bedroom and there's 3 people making the game total. If that's a great place to get started.